So the session is called Not My Country, and it's on Republic Day. I thought about putting it in the At the Republic group of sessions, but I thought that's too dark a thought on a happy day. So over to you, Shantanu.
Thank you, Malavika, and thank you for organizing this panel. And yes, Amit, Mr. Rai is here, so please come on. I was just hoping he would come before I finish my introduction. Not my country. In fact, as I said at another panel, you know, when you have a legendary author like Kiran, somebody as scholarly as Alok Rai, and somebody is just bursting onto the on the literary scene with Wounds of the Dead, it's such a brilliant book. You know, you have three of them, you get an editor free. So I'll just keep this. And in fact, I've been told by Vikram that Vikram, Kiran, and Alok ji have sort of discussed this panel between themselves at the Taj Bengal, and so they're going to keep to that and ask me to keep quiet about it. So, you know, I'll do my keeping quiet and I'll let them do the talking, except that I'll just start off. Since the topic of the panel is Not My India, I'd like each one of you to sort of start off with asking you, what's your idea of India, and do you think it's reflected in the writing that we have, particularly English writing in India? Kiran, I think you should start off on that. Yeah. I'll come to Vikram at the end after Alok ji.
Okay. You heard the term bakra? I make a good bakra, even though I have a very thin neck. I can't tell you, I mean, I think you do know this, how critical this particular subject is. Before I start off, I wanted to ask, Alok, you want to come in first?
I thought just sort of, as it were.
That's why I asked you, yeah?
Okay.
I'll take revenge afterwards, okay?
All right. Okay, so I am his chosen, I'm the Bakra's Bakra, so to speak. Anyway. Yeah. No, basically, I'm the kind of English prof in this group, right? And so this is the kind of thing that I'm, in some sense, trained to do. So what we thought of actually was that I would just take a few minutes and, as it were, create a kind of field within which then we can wander, basically. I want to come back to what you started with, by the way, when you said Not My India. And I'm not sure India is there in the title.
Not my country.
The title is Not My Country. I don't see where India comes into it, frankly. You know, I mean, and indeed that is part of what we want to talk about, really. So, you know, the way I reframed the question for us for today is, and this is what I, in fact, talked to Kiran about as well, is what is the writer's country, right? What is the writer's country? You see, at one level, we are perfectly happy to talk about private worlds. We all inhabit private worlds. We are happy to talk about private universes. Yeah, okay, sorry. Private worlds, private universes, we have no problem with talking about those. But the moment one actually tries to problematize the idea of country, like, what is the writer's country? What is your country? All right? It immediately becomes, it has a sort of whiff of controversy about it immediately. So worlds and universes are fine, but country is problematic. Now, I want to say a few things around this theme, basically. That I think certainly a kind of literate audience will have no problem in conceding the idea that just as worlds and universes can be private, we can all inhabit private countries. You know, I live in my country, and so on. But the crucial thing about a writer's country is that a writer's country cannot be entirely private. You see, if I inhabit an entirely private country, I'm probably out of my mind. All right? It is imperative that the privacy of a writer's country be habitable by others. that even though it is a private country, it is a country which other people can also inhabit, can enter, all right? And for this transformation to happen, for what might be merely private to remain private, but also become habitable, it must be imagined in some detail. That, you know, the writer's country is a country which is imagined in sufficient detail for someone who enters it for the first time to find their way around it and gradually begin to feel at home in it. So what is crucial about the writer's country is that it is both private and habitable. So far, so unproblematic, right? We are reasonably happy with these formulations. However, again, the reason why there is a whiff of controversy about saying private country is that country in our mind equals nation, right? And so, what's your country? My country is private, but and so one seems to be on the edge of debates about nationalism. Now, I don't want to go there. But except to say that even in the case of nations, of course, even nations have to be imagined, and this is in some sense obviously a kind of commonplace in academia, that we all inhabit imagined communities, which is the title of a very famous book, all right? So but this country-nation equivalence, as it were, becomes problematic in the context of nationalism, so I will leave that aside. Okay. With writers' countries, the countries that have been, as it were, imagined by our distinguished writers here, these countries obviously, unlike real geographical countries, or perhaps like real geographical countries, I'm not even sure about that in Bengal anymore, but they don't have, as it were, distinct boundaries. These countries, in fact, overlap, right? These countries and they become interesting because they overlap, right? And indeed, that these various countries that are imagined by different people stand in a kind of ironic, variable relation both to each other and necessarily to that thing which hypothetically we call the real world. Because of course, if a country were entirely imaginary and stood in no relation to a knowable world, it would not be interesting. So it is basically, so the writer's country, and it's a tough ask, is that it is private, habitable, and recognizable. So that basically is kind of my frame for thinking about the problematic that we have before us today. Over to you.
Yeah, so that sort of sets the agenda for Kiran and Vikram. So Kiran, as I said, like what's as an author, what's your idea of the country? And when we say the country, we immediately say not my country, not my India, sort of thing. So what's your idea of, as an author? I have read your books right from Cuckold and 7 Sixes of 43 and Cuckold and the Ravanan editoriology, and they have all been sort of, Cuckold of course is a historical fiction. Jasoda, in contrast, is unlike any of the other works. Like even Ravan and Eddie, for example, had unfold in very urban settings, though the characters are marginalized. They represent a sort of other India, but within the thing. But Jasoda, for example, is a entirely different country, is an entirely different thing. So on that note, what's your idea of the country? What's your idea of the country if I say it's India, and is that being reflected in the writing that we have today?
First of all, I just want to add something to what my friend there said at the beginning, and which is that it might be an imaginary country that we occupy. All of us, even those who are non-writers, have their own private worlds. The point is, when a writer puts his country down on paper and it's finally printed, you don't need a visa, you don't need a passport. If it's terrific stuff, you're automatically taken into the fold of the citizens. If it's someone like Faulkner, then it takes time. But over time, just the presence of a tremendous classic, but which at the outset seemed impenetrable. I don't know how this happens, but by the sheer fact of its presence over the years, over decades, it suddenly not only assumes there's a halo around it, granted, but also it becomes far more accessible, I think. Each one of us has his own prejudices. If I start listing mine, I'll be thrown out within the first 3 seconds, okay? So I will not go into that. I know that Alok said that we will not go into nationalism at all. You'll have to forgive me, okay? Because let's just say that when I was about 18, I think, I don't remember, 17 or 18, I fell ill first with double typhoid, and then I fell ill with smallpox, despite the fact that I had been vaccinated. This personal history is for a purpose. So हमारे घर में, in my house, usually we had books, but on that particular occasion, we did not have anything. And smallpox is not something that comes and goes in 2 days. So I hunted wildly for some book to read, and believe it or not, I came across a biography of Gandhi by a French author. Now, Nehru was very popular in my house. I think Gandhi got some kind of secondary step-sisterly or step-brotherly treatment. So I was not at all keen on, ye kya hai, my folks don't like this guy. No, that's not true. They're not crazy about him the way they were about Nehru. Anyway, I started to read because I had nothing else to read. And like the other coincidences in my life, I cannot tell you how grateful I was. We have lots of room to disagree, okay? Please don't think that I'm trying to force my views. But it had an impact which over the years grew. Of course, one of the things that I liked enormously about Gandhiji was the fact that he had such a terrific sense of humor. I mean, that wisp of a man could call himself a quack. He was always coming up with new medical treatments for his own diseases. And it's absolutely shocking that he survived. I mean, his own treatment, most of us by just reading the treatment would die, Again, you recall, what he said, he was asked when he met King George V, he was asked, you went to see him in this langot kind of dhoti that you wear? So you remember his reply, no? No, he was wearing enough clothes for both of us. Now, I am not going into what Gandhi meant to me, but the fact that there was humor there is something that I miss so desperately in these times. Alok, you might even agree with this.
Yeah, we have become a very sort of...
Oh my God! Can we have a conversation? I'm talking about the politicians here. Yeah, please forgive me for taking names. When Nirmala Sitaraman comes, I go and lock myself into the toilet, okay? Mere se nahi jamta bhai ye. And I keep asking, will one of them at least crack a joke and be open to some doubt? And I think one of the things that Alok is also trying to tell us about through that framework that he created is the fact that one of the things that humor does is that it plants doubts.
Humor is subversive.
Absolutely, exactly. So, अच्छा ये तो मैं मानता हूँ, I completely agree कि everybody else but me is a fool, right? But the problem with having a sense of humor or doubt is that, ओए खुदा, I am also an ass. That levels the field and it makes life so much more tolerant, and also it gives you colossal insights. I'm going to stop here, we'll get back to things. Huh?
No, I just wanted to, you
Sorry,
didn't answer the Jasoda bit, but we'll come back to that.
Sorry.
Yeah, so,
तो मैं भूल गया.
because now that you talk of humor, I'll come back to that because unlike Ravan and Eddie or Kakor, Jasoda does not have that humor. Is it because of the state of the country that is that darkness? We'll come back to that, but just while you reflect on that, Vikram.
एक चीज. Alok, interrupt, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anytime.
Please
Interrupt
please.
anytime you want.
Yeah, please. Vikram, you come into this with a very different perspective. You were born and brought up in Bombay, and I hear you had your medical training in back of beyond Wasepur. I think Wasepur, is it?
No. I had my med school in Mumbai. But I'd gone for a rural health rotation. I can talk a little bit about that.
So it's very strange to find a modern work of fiction that's not urban, that's not set in Bombay or Delhi, and that's not about jazzy, snazzy people, and So you chose the book, set the book in the middle of nowhere sort of thing. There's a desolation about the place, and I've heard from people that you actually were in a place like that and kept wondering if a pregnant woman were to come, what would you do, because the clinic had nothing. And the clinic that's there in this book is much like, kind of that. But coming from the US, and now then you move to the US, what kind of perspective do you bring into the question? That country was supposed to be this free nation, free thought, free everything, till about this man came about with his vision of Bhagwa Trumpism, that, it's become Saffron Trump, like what. So how do you sort of come into the picture? How does your work, Wounds of the Dead, fit into the idea of this being not my country, and addressing issues which modern fiction I don't see addressing much.
He's an oncologist, huh? You be careful now.
The name of this panel, Not My Country, had when I was asked to be on this panel, it actually had a pretty.
Are you audible? Is he audible? Because otherwise.
Hold it close. Hold it.
Can you hear me? Okay. It had a particular sense of poignancy for me because I was born and raised in Mumbai. I consider myself a Bombay boy through and through. I went to medical school in that city, and then I went to the United States to be a physician scientist in 2005, and I've been there for 12 years. And I just became a citizen of the United States because I really did want to participate in the democratic process. Exactly. And the first election I voted in, Donald Trump becomes president.
Take it back.
And so, but I think I've been comfortable with the sense of exile right since the beginning. So now I'm exiled from two societies instead of being exiled from one society. So, the distinction between the author's nation and instead of the author's country, I would say the author's land, perhaps is another way of thinking about it. I might be able to give a sense of what I meant with that in the context of my book. So just to give you a sense of what my book is about, The Wounds of the Dead is set in a tiny, dilapidated, rural clinic in the middle of nowhere. And a surgeon is working there, desperately unhappy with his life and battling with government bureaucracy that prevents resources that he needs for patient care from being delivered to the clinic. And then one night, he is visited by a young man, his pregnant wife, and their 8-year-old son, who tell him that they have been murdered. And they say that they have been given the opportunity to live again, and at dawn, blood will start to flow through their veins again. And if their wounds are not stitched, they will bleed to death and die another second horrible death. And so they beg the surgeon to stitch up their wounds in the middle of the night in this clinic that has absolutely nothing. So when I initially conceptualized this idea, what I wanted to do was take the everyday dilemma of a doctor. A patient comes to you, how can I don't think doctors really think in terms of how can I save the person's life, but how can I improve oxygen delivery to their lungs, or how can I bring their blood pressure back to a normal range. But I wanted to take that rather mundane dilemma and give it a sort of existential, larger resonance. And that's when I came up with the idea of trying to have a doctor actually bring the dead back to life. And so then, where would I set this kind of thing? Now, of course, I cannot set it in the city, because then, the doctor will call his friend and say, "Yaar, bahut ajeeb cheezein ho rahi hai, aa jao, just help me out." And so I had to have it in a place of isolation and desolation. In order to do that, I drew from an experience that Shantanu mentioned. So during my final year of my medical schooling, we have something called a rural health rotation, where we're posted in some clinic, and I was posted in a small village named Wangni, which is 3 hours from Mumbai. And I was there for 3 weeks. It was supposed to be me and another one of my co-students and a senior doctor. The co-student never showed up, and he somehow managed to get his completion certificate anyway. I showed up there, and the senior doctor, after a day, said, "Haan, main ja raha hu chutti par." And so me, a final year medical student who had only theoretical knowledge of how to actually deal with a sick person, was in this little village clinic and supposed to treat these patients. And thankfully, the only people who came there were minor injuries. I had to do a couple of stitches, maybe give out some antibiotics. But I would lie awake at night thinking, what if a woman shows up in labor? What if someone comes there with appendicitis? What in the world am I going to do? And so I was able to actually transport that experience into this book and portray, and you can decide how successful it has been, a doctor in this desperately isolated setting, dealing with circumstances that are completely beyond what he fathomed. It was interesting. I thought a lot about. There's a certain amount of critique of the system, of corruption, of the way the Indian society sometimes seems to be stuck in an equilibrium where the incentives are geared towards bribing the person out there, because if you don't, you pay a price. And I thought about, I'm living there a cushy life in America. Do I have the right to talk about these things? And then eventually I thought that if I address the issue with dignity and respect and authenticity and try to portray it with as much sincerity as I can, then perhaps it will come forth to the reader that they're reading an authentic story, and it will be meaningful to them. I also wanted to address something that Alok ji mentioned. When we were just talking about when I read Godan a couple of years ago, I thought that Godan was full of so many cliches. But then what we don't realize is when it was published in the 1930s, everything that came after that took the tropes from Godan and used them as raw material. And so the themes that are prevalent in Godan have become now so common in our perception of village life. It's a little like watching The Seven Samurai by Kurosawa, and you think every single scene in it is a cliche, but that's only because every samurai movie that came after it and every Western movie that came after it aped the themes from that book. And so in a way, the author is not only portraying reality, but to some extent even influencing the way reality is perceived after that.
Precisely. I mean, that's sort of what I meant about inventing a country. In some sense, he invented a rural India. Now, some of it is the same, some of it is not. But as a fact of the imagination, it sits heavily on one. So that if one wants to imagine it, to imagine another country that overlaps with the geographical space, then in fact he is forced to resort to some kind of stratagem whereby he can shed this enormous weight, basically. Basically it's a kind of writerly predicament that you have to make your own country, that you can't say, I'll take that one. Because if you take that one, then you're merely imitating someone. and it's the easy way out. But the real challenge, as for Faulkner, as you mentioned, is to actually invent a country,
It's interesting that Godan and Premchand comes into the picture, because one of the questions I had, and in terms of how I saw the thing about modern Indian fiction not reflecting the other India, like we don't talk of what is called the other India. If I'm not mistaken, the panel had a subtitle, on other India. See, it's interesting that Premchandji's name came up because his presidential address at the progressive PWA actually talked about, I know again it's 80 years back and a different time, different era. But in terms of what literature or a work of fiction should aspire to, is that still applicable? And do you think we are sort of adhering to it, or have we moved away from it?
See, I think there are sort of two levels of discourse here. All right, one is is that universe which was imagined in the 1930s still in some sense corresponding to the actual social realities of our time?
Yeah, because farmers, like he talked about the farmers, and we have that problem even today. And he talked about it. We, in our modern, particularly the modern English fiction, we are not talking about farmers at all. There are very few books, like I haven't come across a book that's talking about the present situation as they face it. So that's what.
But that to me, you see, one is obviously the kind of inertial persistence of exploitation of a certain kind. All right, which is obviously the case, that it still, unfortunately, you still have rural indebtedness, you still have people being driven off the land, you still have people who are hungry, ... But I think I'm also interested in the writerly challenge that someone faces, that that if you want to write a novel and you produce yet another watered down version of Godan, what's the point of doing it? Don't bother. You see, so the writerly challenge is actually, and the heavier the weight that sits on you, the bigger the challenge is, in some sense. How are you going to do this? I was reminded basically when you talked about rural India and that sort of thing, that if you remember English August, Upamanyu, all right? So he sort of cheats a little by actually transplanting a civil servant in his first year of service into the thing. But actually English August is about him. It's not really about the reality. But I can see why. Because to find an original way of talking about that kind of thing is not easy. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm looking forward to it precisely because I am also extremely conscious. This, by the way, if I may digress a little, there was a lovely film made on the painter Jackson Pollock. And and the kind of American, and at some point in it, Pollock is asked, why? Because Pollock does these lovely sort of drip paintings, right? Yeah. And he's asked why. And he said, quite simply, I mean, what the painters of that generation are conscious of is the weight of Picasso, that they can't keep on doing Picasso. They've got to find some new language. And if I have a complaint about contemporary writing, it is basically that writers are inadequately conscious of the creative challenge that they confront. Because merely producing, I'm sorry you're a publisher, but merely producing publishable fiction is not adequate. I mean, if we were to give the word creative the weight it deserves, it is a heroic challenge to be creative, and I am hungry for it. I look around for it, that is there some creation there, as opposed to, give me a few more meters of Godan, as it were.
I was thinking that, for instance, the country that he created, right? This is where the act of criticism turns up when you're a reader. If you find it real enough, if you find that you're buying into what he's saying, then what you've got is a successful book. But what happens when an author goes deeply into fantasy? Then nothing is of this earth in that sense. So for someone like the dear man who wrote Alice in Wonderland, to make every single character there and their interaction, it's way beyond believable. You just walk into it and you don't want to get out. So then you have something which, as Alok has been trying to tell us, it is author country, completely invented, and sometimes far more real than the life that you yourself lead. And I find that truly intriguing. I'm incapable of writing fantasies of this kind, but which is not to say.
But not really. Your Cuckold was in that sense a creative work of the sort of to imagine a triangle between Meera and her husband and Lord Krishna is unimaginable. So
I just remember one line which I always try and remember about Cuckold. We were that rarest of couples. Even after years of marriage, we were madly in love. I with her and she with somebody else. Because I think that really sums up the dilemma of Mirabai's husband, about whom, we just pushed him into a dark hole and we've never wanted to look at him. Alok, you want to say something?
I'm fascinated by that, Kiran, because in some sense, you see, because obviously as we know, Rajputana is an entirely imagined place. It doesn't exist. It comes out of James Todd. Todd's annals invented Rajputana, and now weird things like the Karni Sena are found within it, because they are inhabiting that imagined universe. Clearly, it never existed, but it's an entirely imaginary universe. What you've done is actually to invade that world and plant a sort of subversive element, saying, apart from this kind of mad queen, there is also the cuckold. Yes. And when you look at that world through the eyes of the cuckold, that world is subtly, and I would suggest creatively, transformed, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. You'd have problems publishing it at this point of time, don't you think so? In this country that we live in now?
Do I have problems? I would like to live is my problem, okay?
Sorry.
Well, since Rajputana was mentioned, I was just watching the news this morning, and I was just flipping back and forth between a couple of channels, and I was struck by the contrast between the grand parade on Rajpath with the military and the Jawans and female soldiers doing these acrobatic things on bikes, and then you swap and there are clips of the Karni Sena and the buses being burned, and this juxtaposition of the strength of the state and yet a display of its weakness, that a bunch of no-name goons can just hold a country hostage in a way. It just seemed to me such a weird contrast. And it made me wonder what exactly is our country of
Absolutely.
those two.
I had this thing, we have had, I think, news snippets around, 1% of the population owning 73% of its wealth. We talk of Davos and Shanghai and malls and glitzy flyovers, and that is the face of the country that we sort of project, and that is also in many ways the face of Indian writing in English. But a country that once had actually coined a slogan like Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, now we don't hear of them. Jawans are for slaughters at the border, Kisans are for suicides at every state. So is there a place for them in Indian fiction? Have we lost that space?
Well, of course, I mean, there's definitely I do think that English writers tend to come from convent school educated cities. But, you know, if you look at the Marathi Sahitya Sammelan, they aren't even held in Mumbai or Pune. They're held in smaller towns. And I try to listen to clips online that I can of them. And many of the authors do write about rural concerns. But there is definitely a disconnect between local language or non-English fiction in India and the concerns that are raised there and English language fiction.
I'd like to go to Alokji on that because you brought in the question of the publisher, you know, like I come from the, so this urban tilt, this face of India that we see in writing in English, is it also because that the English readership is largely urban? You know, like it's not penetrated, unless it's a Chetan Bhagat, the readership for English novels has remained largely English, and that the people writing in English are based in urban centers, so they don't know the hinterland well enough to represent that. And linked to that, your experience of regional writing, is that representing the situation that we have, the country that we writing in Hindi?
You see, I'm sure that the facts of literacy and urbanization and, you know, that kind of thing certainly they play into what gets published, because the publisher is interested in reaching readers. It also enters into what gets written. But, you know, I mean, that is, as it were, the macro question, from the kind of commercial point of view. I am actually intrigued by the reluctance of people to enter into the creative challenge of doing it. Because after all, you know, when I've just recently, so my head is full of it, I've been reading a novel by an Irish writer set in the period of the American Civil War. I've been reading Days Without End. And obviously there's nothing in common between his world, the world that he inhabits every day, and the world that he's writing about. But it's an extraordinary act of imagination to be able to enter that world and produce something. Now that is the kind of daring, to be honest, that I look for in writers, you know, of daring to do something which is not easy to do, you see. Otherwise, you know, one gets, so to speak, a given reality, a given country. And, you know, that given country is available in recognizable forms. You do this version, or you do that, or you do that. You know, as you said, you know, those stereotypes are easily available.
I mean, I agree. As a reader, I would rather read an ambitious writer who doesn't necessarily succeed in every goal that he's doing, but is doing something different, as opposed to a competent writer who is competently presenting another variation of something that we've seen before. I agree. Yeah.
I want to enter slightly different territory. Shantanu, actually, the deification of the soldier, despite the fact that we make sure that they're bumped off non-stop. Oh God, please forgive me. I have committed the crime that I never forgive. So okay, I've done it. Sorry. No, but, you know, what happens is that by continually sentimentalizing the soldier, and then you have a commander-in-chief who, perhaps, you know, I mean, please forgive me for saying this, but if there was a doctor here like him, and he could sew his lips up, it would help the country a lot if he was made to shut up. I'm talking about the commander-in-chief. But what is happening all the time is that instead of humor and even realism allowing us to understand the colossal consequences of the relationship between the two countries, we are not even aware of our history, that we chose a civilian government and a civilian control of the army. And recently, about, I don't know, maybe a year ago or something, we learned that the defense minister says that I have left it to the army. The only difference between Pakistan and India is the fact that they don't have civilian rule and we have it. Now, when is it that we are going to actually genuinely think of civilian constitutional rule as sacred? You know, I know I'm straying away from fiction, but I'm coming back to fiction also in one sense. What censorship is doing to this country, the fact that no dissent is permitted because it is immediately interpreted as sedition. Sedition. I wrote a play a very long time ago. Believe it or not, it's difficult to believe, but I was young at one time. And the play was called Bedtime Story. It was, the theme of the play is anything that happens anywhere in the world, whether it is Iraq, whether it is in our country or anywhere else, you and I as citizens are responsible. And one of the things that this play did was to take the episode of Ekalavya. I mean, there are just 4 episodes from the Mahabharata. I find that because the play was banned legally and extra legally, and Shantanu and his one-time senior editor, Kartika, were the first people who allowed it to be published 38 years after it was written. But the reason that I'm bringing this up is because the principal understanding, as I've said so often, is that censorship comes in because people who have never read the book are the ones who are going to say this needs to be banned. I mean, the irony of it seems to be completely lost, that the Ayatollah of Iran had never read the book. He just heard people from India say that this is a blasphemous book. And it was done so. And who was it in India who would read satanic verses, for God's sake? Kabhi aapne socha hai? Have you tried to read it? It's not an easy book to read. But the episode of Ekalavya is simply this. And it is very recently that I myself realized the colossal importance of Ekalavya in our life, and we just don't want to deal with him. Because we've been told that he is this relationship between Dronacharya and Ekalavya is an iconic one. It is sacred beyond words. Every student, at least in my time, was told, look at this. This is the way you respect your guru. What I did with the play, to be very brief, I wish you could read it. The first episode is Ekalavya, and I realize now that Ekalavya is perhaps the only person in our mythology who is self-made. There is no, yeah, sure, he had a teacher who told him, bugger off. You are a tribal. I mean, for us in our eyes, whether we like it or not, tribals are exactly the same as untouchables. For God's sake, I close my eyes, man. I don't want to look at an untouchable. But Ekalavya, who is told off, goes for years into the forest. He practices and practices and comes up with an archery which beats Arjun. Hollow, absolutely. Arjun is incapable of competing with him. Do we appreciate this? I don't think we understand it at all, because we've been told time and again, hey, Dronacharya is the ultimate. Have we ever questioned this? And what does Ekalavya do? He's not only self-made, we make him do exactly what we want him to do. The wonderful thing about the Mahabharata is that it is a realistic piece of work. Which guru is going to allow a bloody faltu chap like Ekalavya to take over and beat Arjun? So Dronacharya is doing what he should be doing as a teacher of the royal family. But have we looked at Ekalavya? He is better at the job. And believe it or not, my Ekalavya, when he's asked time and again to say whether he will do what his teacher wants, which is the teacher wants his Guru Dakshina, as you know, that's a tradition. And Ekalavya says to him, to Dronacharya, Abhi kitne dafe, how many times are you going to ask me the same question? I told you, whatever you want, I will do it. And of course, Dronacharya asks for the right thumb. And my Ekalavya's answer to him is that he bends down, he picks up a bit of earth, he spits into it, he makes a thumb and says, Jaisa Guru, Vaisi Guru Dakshina. What I'm trying to get at is that we don't even want to think about the way we treat the tribals, and then we complain we want to murder the Naxalites. Arey bhai, but the grievances might be very real, nahi? What are we doing? And you know, the same thing for, I have never understood, please forgive my saying so, why is it that the Dalits and people don't perform this, at least just the first act of this play? Because it asserts their independence, and it should tell us, bugger off and keep your bloody quotas to yourself. We've had 70 years of it, spend all the money in the world on our education, and we'll show you we don't need 35 marks to pass, okay? We will give you better grades than your best students. I don't know how to convince anybody about it.
Well, since you mentioned Eklavya, I think given that we're as it were striking such dark notes here, that I mean, there's something completely unrelated to the subject here, but friends of mine who've been running an NGO devoted to education in rural India, in Madhya Pradesh, for the last 30 years, and their organization is called Eklavya. That is what they do. So, so there are people who, I mean, I think the tradition is obviously there in order to be taken, if it is truly ours, not respected, but appropriated, made something of. I mean, and one hardly needs to say it to a Calcutta audience, but obviously Draupadi is there as an icon which has been reshaped in order to say all kinds of other things than what is intended in the original text. And that to me is what a creative appropriation of the tradition is, or what you've done with Meera. Pushed Meera aside and given that poor cuckold a voice.
Alok, as somebody who till recently was a professor, you retired, you just told me you retired as a professor in Delhi University. This fear that Kiran talks about, the country we live in is a country of fear, like it took us 40 years to publish this book because nobody would allow him to publish it, nobody would allow him to stage it. Do you think the students, the young people that you have interacted with are looking at this differently? Is there a hope out there for out of this fear, or are they, because when I go online and look at the trolls and the stuff that goes out in terms of you as an author, recently we published a book by a poet, and that had a reference to the parliament as a hammam full of naked people, which is very telling. It's a wonderful metaphor for what. And the day the book was published and he read the poem at a lit fest, 3 days later he writes to me that I have received these threats on my thing saying that you are on thin ice, your reference to the parliament as a hammam and to politicians as naked, and another poem which referred to Bhagwa. Please ask your publishers to pulp the book and reprint. So, and this is a young man who is writing. A lot of these trolls are young people, do you think your experience as a teacher, is this generation or the generation ahead is going to make a difference? Or are we so inured to it? The fear is so great that you cannot say anything about anybody in power now and get away. You know, like you draw a cartoon from a celebrated Satyajit Ray thing and name the minister, and then you are, you know, sort of, you land up in such big trouble. Your students, what do you say? Do you think there's hope, you know, like?
You're asking an old man of 70 if there's hope. Look,
Yeah,
India
is 70, so, you know, like.
Wait. Look, it was a long time ago that I was young, along with Kiran. So, but I still remember that at that time we used to say, never trust anyone over 30. You see? And I would hesitate to say anything about young people. The one thing I miss about being a teacher is that I'm no longer in touch with young people. You know, but I wait to hear from them. I want to hear from them. And I have been delighted to be surprised by young people in country after country. I'm waiting for my own, you know, because it's obvious sort of, you know, old people like, you know, you get I mean, some of us, Kiran and I, you know, and we'll grumble. What else do you expect me to do? I will grumble. I can grumble fluently. But don't trust that. You know, certainly I will not volunteer an opinion about young people like these days. I mean, I've just read a book which has just been published called Kids These Days, which Kids These Days picks up a phrase which older people like me use, right? Or what's the matter with kids these days, doing selfies, self-absorbed and so on. That's me, all right? I'm prepared, I am ready, I am eager, I am hungry to be surprised by the young. Because that is which is why I look at him and I'm encouraged, you know? Makes me feel good.
Yeah, in fact, before we throw the panel open to questions, I wanted to come to you. They have been talking about old people and, you know, you are the young one here and new book, second book and all, and coming from a entirely different perspective. What do you see of, you know, you say you have taken US citizenship. I am reminded of Gulzar Saab's very famous poem where he ends, you know, that this is my country, but that is my motherland. You know, like he was born in Dina, Pakistan, and that's a huge statement to make, you know, and he has drawn flack for it. People have written to him saying that, Acha, tu to Musalman hai isliye. They don't even understand that Gulzar is not Muslim, you know, like.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So what is your take on the country?
Before he starts, I want to clarify one thing, you know. I'm 17, yaar.
Yeah.
You know, the issue of young people and the youth is actually an interesting question because ISIS is almost entirely angry young men. And that's something the young people come in with the ability to think about issues differently. They are not necessarily tied to the old orthodoxies, and so they can bring a fresh perspective on issues. But yet they also end up being a reservoir for anger that can be tapped and channeled into extremist causes. So whether it's ISIS or whether it's, you know, any of the alphabet soup of either jihadi groups or also Hindutva groups that are coming up. I think they are all going to be driven by young men, unfortunately. I think one thing that, well, you know, bringing it back to the author, the job of the author, the best an author can do is try to present to society a different way of thinking and try to influence both people who are try to present to people both who are older and experienced about society and perhaps are set in their ways, as well as younger people who may be open to newer ways of thinking, and try to present their perspectives with compassion, with empathy, with dignity, and try to present perspectives on populations that have previously been hidden, whether it's Naxalites, whether it's tribals, whether it's the rural farmer who's committing suicide, and so I think, and so I'll end there, but that's what I think the role of the author is, to illuminate the dispossessed.
So yeah.
Okay, He's going to pass the mic to the audience. Make sure that you make us uncomfortable with very pointed questions. But I just wanted to end this part of it about the main theme was the country that one occupies, right? And I'll tell you the country that I want to occupy. It's just 2 lines. This is my reimagining of Kabir. There is only one God, and her name is life. She's the only one worthy of worship. All else is irrelevant. If I can't respect my Kabir, then I don't know who to respect.
On that note, would like to have, I'm being told 3 questions. Is that all right? Yeah.
Hello sir, my name is Priyankar. So I would like to ask a question is that as you all people have been raising about the slogan that you were telling that Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. Also we heard that Jai Vigyan was also being added later. So in this 21st century, in modern time, can we find that the science is well advanced for the all-round development in our countries, especially into the rural part, or is just a point of exploitation? Because in our country where we find that some suffragist leaders are saying that Charles Darwin's theory is not proper, they are challenging it, that is why.
And that Ganesha was the first plastic surgery
yes.
thing.
Yes. But what are you saying?
I'm just asking.
At least a few days ago, I was a gorilla. And I went to the forest. And now I'm a human being here. Kya baat kar rahe ho aap?
No.
Wait, don't take me seriously. Yaar.
No, I'm not taking it seriously. But that's my question is that how can we say that we are in the advanced stage of our society?
Okay. So we need to let you go. Yeah, just yeah. So,
please forgive me. Arrangements were made earlier that this chap called Kiran Nagarkar shut his bloody trap. So I have to catch a flight. But thank you so much. Alok, thank you. And thank you, Vikram. And of course, thank you, Shantanu. Thank you so much. And God bless you all. You're right. If we continue with our current regime, then we'll be moving forward very fast.
last question. Yeah.
So just taking up the issue of challenges, you can't expect people to face creative challenges when you don't teach them to challenge what they are taught from a very young age. You don't teach them that there can be more than one side to a question. You don't teach them that there may be one side to who you are. So on a personal level, I come of mixed parentage, and what happens when you're using a single surname is you subvert the other, right? So I have been questioned because I read both Hindi and Bangla literature. I have been ignored by a section of the population who think I should read the other language only in translation. And I have been questioned because they think that no sane person can actually try to embrace so many identities or so many cultural threads at the same time. So where does the author then stand on that? Where does the individual stand on that? It's not so much of what you want to be. It's also what people want to make you or what they think you should be. So, half the fight is trying to say, look at me, I am not what you think I am so and so.
I think obviously it's a huge subject, we're out of time, but we are obviously a deeply conservative society. And, the only way in which the shackles of a conservative society can be broken, really, is education, and I'm afraid we haven't done a very good job of that, to be honest, because otherwise, as it were, families merely reproduce. If one wants to break the chain somewhere, education is the only known way of doing it, and we haven't done very well. So it's a large subject. I've spent my life in education, and trying to do what you suggest should be done. There's only one man.
Thank you so much, Vikram.
Well, I'll just add one thing. The United States is going through an existential crisis just being able to accommodate Spanish as a second language for some subset of its population only speaking Spanish. And so I would say it's actually a virtue of India that we are able to accommodate so much diversity and integrate it. We could do a better job, but I encourage your reading and writing in both of the languages. And a third.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. Alokji, thank you for steering this. And Vikram, wonderful to have you here. Please buy his book. It's like nothing you have read before. Please do buy his book, The Wounds of the Dead. Thank you.